I never imagined a quiet weekend at my lake house could turn into a full-blown neighborhood nightmare. One moment, I was prepping my fishing boat for a sunrise trip, and the next, a message popped up from the HOA. "We're towing your property." But it wasn't my boat that vanished. It was something completely unexpected. A petty neighbor, obsessed with control, had triggered a chain of events that would leave the entire community talking. How did a simple dispute over a boat escalate into instant chaos, and who would pay the ultimate price for their arrogance? Life in our lakeside community had always been quiet. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and weekends smelled like fresh pine and coffee. My small family had moved here chasing peace. Just a simple home, a boat docked in the private cove, and a few hours of escape from the constant noise of city life. Mornings were spent polishing the deck, afternoons fishing off the pier, and evenings drifting in the still water, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We weren't flashy. Our little boat wasn't the newest model, but it was ours, and it carried the kind of memories money can't buy. Lazy Saturdays with friends, the thrill of catching our first bass, quiet conversations under stars that felt too big to name. The kids would run along the shoreline, skipping rocks, their laughter mingling with the gentle lapping of the water. Life felt safe, familiar, and untouchable. But even in a community built on shared calm, small cracks existed. Rules whispered in newsletters and subtle reminders on bulletin boards hinted at boundaries nobody fully questioned. Guidelines about docks, boats, and vehicles parked, or improperly. Most residents ignored them, or followed them quietly, accepting the occasional notice with a shrug. I'd never thought much of it. Compliance seemed straightforward enough, and trouble was something that happened elsewhere. Then there was Karen, a neighbor who arrived with the perfect smile, the polite nod, the house always immaculate, and a reputation for vigilance. Everyone called her the community watchdog, and while most found her overbearing, few anticipated the kind of obsession she carried for control. To her, rules weren't suggestions, they were weapons, tools to enforce dominance over anyone who dared inconvenience her meticulously ordered world. At first, I barely noticed her. A friendly wave over the fence, the occasional comment about our garden, harmless enough. But in the background, subtle lines were being drawn, lines that would soon turn every lazy weekend on the lake into a battlefield. Little did I know, a simple morning preparing my fishing boat would set off a chain of events that turned neighborly oversight into an all-out conflict, with consequences none of us could have imagined. At first, the notices were small, almost laughable. A polite slip slid under the door, the kind you might expect from a conscientious neighborhood. Watch. Remainder boats must be registered with the HOA. Please ensure no vehicles are parked within 3 feet of docks. I chuckled, thinking it was nothing more than a formality. Our boat had been docked in the same spot for years, and our pickup truck had never caused anyone a second's inconvenience. But that laugh quickly died in my throat when a second notice arrived, more pointed and insistent. Non-compliance may result in fines or removal of property. It didn't take long for Karen to make her presence known. What had begun as friendly waves and casual observations morphed into a relentless series of complaints. Every morning, I would find her scrutinizing the dock, sometimes leaning across the fence, taking notes or snapping photos with her phone. She cataloged everything: the slight tilt of the boat, a cooler left out overnight, the way my kayak sat against the railing. No detail was too minor for her vigilant eye. The HOA, once a background hum in community life, suddenly felt like a shadow that followed every step. Meetings became tense exercises in subtle intimidation. Board members, once polite and cooperative, now read statements aloud about community compliance, as if my family were criminal suspects. Fines began appearing, a few $100s here, a couple of hundred there, accumulating faster than I could keep track of them. And every fine carried the same chilling warning: future violations will result in property removal. I tried reasoning with them. I sent emails, presented receipts proving registration, even offered to move the boat a few feet to satisfy their vague guidelines. Each attempt at diplomacy only seemed to feed the fire. Karen would appear at meetings, smiling with perfect civility, her voice calm but sharp, delivering reports on my infractions with precision that felt almost surgical. It was clear she was enjoying the struggle, her satisfaction growing with every polite rebuttal I made. The tension bled into daily life. I couldn't leave the boat unattended without worrying about a notice, a fine, or worse, a tow. Morning coffees on the deck became exercises in anxiety, my gaze constantly flicking toward the dock as if expecting a tow truck to appear out of nowhere. Even friends who visited were warned by Karen about the rules, as if my entire household had become a public lesson in compliance. Every laugh on the water carried an undercurrent of fear, every relaxed moment shadowed by the possibility of sudden confiscation. Then came the first real escalation. One morning, a truck rolled down the driveway. A black, unmarked vehicle with "authorized tow" emblazoned on the side. My heart sank as two uniformed men stepped out, clipboards in hand. They were not here for the empty lot or abandoned car. They were here for my boat. Panic surged. I ran toward the dock, shouting for them to stop. But Karen's voice rang out across the water, calm and triumphant. "I called it in. It's all above board." Time seemed to stretch as the men circled the boat, jotting down notes, their movements deliberate and exact. I pleaded, showing registration papers, trying to explain the harmlessness of a minor technicality, but it was as if they had been trained to ignore any human context. My stomach twisted with helplessness. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was personal, calculated, designed to intimidate and dominate. The next few days became a relentless siege. Notices multiplied, each more absurd than the last. The HOA claimed I was blocking emergency access, even though the dock's path was clear. A neighbor complained that the boat was visually intrusive from their balcony, a claim so ridiculous it could have been laughed off if not for the mounting fear of fines. Karen's reports were meticulous, backed with time-stamped photos that made the simplest actions seem like deliberate defiance. Frustration turned to determination. I refused to let this petty obsession dictate my life, my family's enjoyment of our home, or our right to simple pleasures. I began documenting everything myself: emails, notices, photographs, even video logs of my boat in its rightful place. Every interaction, every fine, every meeting was meticulously recorded. I wasn't just preparing a defense, I was preparing a counterstrike. But with every step I took toward reclaiming control, the tension escalated. Karen seemed almost prescient, appearing at just the right moment to witness my efforts, taking notes, making reports. Even neighbors began whispering, unsure whether I was the troublemaker or simply resisting an unreasonable authority. The community, once a haven of quiet weekends and friendly waves, now felt like a chessboard, and I was being forced to play by someone else's rules. Then came the most chilling moment, a notice delivered personally by an HOA official, not mailed or slipped under the door. I opened it to read the words: "Property removal scheduled within 48 hours. Non-compliance will result in immediate towing. My pulse pounded. 48 hours to move a boat that couldn't possibly be relocated on my own. 48 hours before my carefully maintained escape from city chaos could be destroyed. Panic, disbelief, and outrage collided, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about a dock or a boat. It was about control, power, and someone's need to assert dominance over my life. The clock was ticking. Friends offered help, neighbors sympathized in hushed tones, and I began planning how to protect what was mine. Every solution seemed precarious, every move fraught with potential escalation. I could feel the moment of confrontation, approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark clouds gathering with an inevitability that left no room for hesitation. What started as petty observations and minor fines was now an all-out battle, and the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. The next morning, I woke to find something entirely unexpected. Karen's own SUV, parked conspicuously across the cul-de-sac, had been involved in a minor but public incident, one that no one could ignore. For a brief, electrifying moment, the power dynamic seemed to shift, but I knew better than to assume victory too soon. The board meetings, the notices, the looming threat of towing. None of it was resolved yet. And in the shadow of all this, a single question lingered in my mind. If someone so obsessed with rules could be so careless with their own property, what would happen when the ultimate confrontation arrived? The morning the towing truck arrived, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach, one that refused to loosen despite the dozens of times I had rehearsed my defense in my head. The sky hung heavy and gray, as if it too sensed the storm about to break over our quiet lakefront. Karen, predictably, was there before anyone else. A picture of perfect composure, leaning casually against the fence, phone in hand, her eyes scanning for every perceived infraction. She smiled that same unsettling smile that had haunted the edges of my days for weeks, as if the world itself conspired to validate her sense of moral superiority. I had spent nights strategizing, reviewing every notice, every board rule, every clause that could be leveraged to my advantage. This was no longer a matter of simply docking my boat or avoiding fines. It had become a contest of control, a battle between someone who cherished dominance and someone who refused to bow. But as the tow truck rolled into view, its engine a low, menacing hum, that courage wavered. My boat sat there, tied to the dock, innocent and defiant, yet completely at the mercy of authority that had twisted neighborly rules into instruments of intimidation. Karen's voice cut through the tense morning air. "This is all above board. You'll see justice served." The tone was calm, almost serene, yet dripping with the kind of vindictive satisfaction that made my blood boil. I could see it in the HOA officials' eyes. The same ones who had delivered the notices, the same ones who had calculated the fines to the exact dollar. The unwavering obedience to a petty agenda, masquerading as rule enforcement. I stepped forward, hands raised, trying one last time to reason with them. I laid out my paperwork, showing every registration, every compliance document. The tow operators nodded politely but remained impassive, their duty clear. Karen, sensing the crack in my resolve, smirked. And then, in a move that would change everything, I revealed the evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past weeks. Time, stamped photographs, video logs, and digital correspondence, all demonstrating the absurdity of the so-called violations. The shift was subtle at first. The HOA official hesitated. Glancing down at the documentation I spread across the dock railing, Karen's smirk faltered, just slightly, as she scrolled through the digital proof on my tablet. The audience of neighbors who had gathered quietly behind the fences, curious, anxious, even fearful, leaned in, sensing the tension crackling like electricity in the air. This was no longer a routine enforcement. It was a showdown, and the rules Karen had wielded like a sword now threatened to rebound on her own carefully curated image. I didn't stop there. I had discovered an overlooked detail buried in the HOA bylaws. Any property removal required not just notice, but a formal hearing and a 2-week window for dispute. I pointed it out, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. The tow truck driver paused, clipboard in hand, reading aloud the section. No property shall be removed until all formal procedures are exhausted, including written hearing requests. Karen's face went pale, and for the first time in weeks, the smug confidence that had fueled her harassment cracked. Neighbors whispered among themselves, eyes wide, sensing the unraveling of a carefully maintained hierarchy. I felt a surge of vindication, not just for myself, but for the principle that no individual, no matter how obsessively meticulous, had the right to weaponize petty rules against others. Karen, desperate to salvage control, raised her voice, insisting that the emergency towing order superseded the bylaws. But I was ready. I had anticipated every angle. I pointed to the HOA's own regulations, citing section after section, revealing the procedural failures that made the order not just questionable, but legally void. The moment stretched, tense and electric. Karen's calm facade collapsed entirely as the crowd, neighbors who had mostly stayed silent out of fear, now watched her stumble, unable to enforce the order she had wielded like a cudgel for weeks. The tow driver looked to the HOA official, who muttered something into their radio before shaking their head. Karen's phone slipped slightly from her grasp as she muttered under her breath, realizing that her plan had failed spectacularly in public. And then, the twist that none of us had fully anticipated. During the scuffle of attention, the tow truck, left unattended for a brief second, while officials consulted paperwork, shifted slightly on the incline of the driveway. The vehicle's hydraulic system engaged unexpectedly, and in a moment both shocking and poetic. Karen's own SUV, parked precariously nearby, rolled forward, bumping against a barricade and leaving visible scratches. The crowd gasped, a mix of shock and suppressed amusement rippling through the spectators. The very symbol of Karen's obsession with control had become collateral in her campaign to dominate mine. Her reaction was priceless. Mouth open, hand over her face, eyes darting between the SUV and the dock, she realized in an instant that the public humiliation was complete. The neighborhood she had once subtly intimidated now witnessed her loss of composure, the irony unmistakable and brutally satisfying. No words could undo what had just happened. The meticulous enforcer of rules had been undone by her own negligence, her image of perfect authority crumbling under the weight of reality. I took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. I could have gloated. I could have reveled in the justice of the instant karma, but the emotion that surged through me was something more nuanced. A mixture of relief, vindication, and the quiet triumph of knowing that persistence, preparation, and calm reasoning had overcome weeks of intimidation. For once, the rules that were meant to control me had been turned back toward their orchestrator, demonstrating that power used unjustly can collapse under its own weight. Yet even in this triumph, I felt the tension linger. Karen, furious and flustered, had retreated slightly, but her presence still loomed like a shadow over the community. The HOA, forced to admit procedural errors, muttered apologies that felt hollow against the backdrop of public spectacle. And the neighbors, some who had supported me quietly, others who had stayed neutral, were now witnesses to the limits of arbitrary authority. The lesson was visible to all. Even the most obsessively enforced rules cannot withstand scrutiny, preparation, and the refusal to be intimidated. As the sun began to pierce through the gray clouds above the lake, casting light on the now damaged SUV and the unscathed boat, a silence settled over the cul-de-sac. It was the calm after a storm, the kind that comes when the tide of power shifts unexpectedly, leaving the former enforcer exposed and the once targeted family standing victorious. I could feel the weight of weeks of anxiety lift, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism, knowing the battle had been won, even if some of the ramifications were yet to unfold. But even as relief surged, a single thought lingered. A question I couldn't ignore. Karen might have lost this battle. But what of the HOA's influence, the subtle rules that could emerge again, the petty obsessions that might target another neighbor next? The climax was over, the immediate threat neutralized, yet the story of control, vigilance, and confrontation within the community was far from finished. What came next, I knew, would test not just the strength of bylaws, but the resilience of anyone brave enough to challenge them. And in that charged silence, I understood one undeniable truth: even the most calculated schemes can unravel, often spectacularly, when arrogance meets preparation. And sometimes, the universe has its own way of delivering poetic justice. The days following the confrontation felt surreal. The cul-de-sac, which had been charged with tension for weeks, seemed to breathe for the first time. My boat sat in its rightful place, untouched, gleaming in the morning sun as if nothing had ever threatened it. The water lapped gently against the dock, carrying with it the faint echo of the chaos that had unfolded. A reminder that even in small communities, tempers, rules, and obsessions can collide in ways no one anticipates. Karen, predictably, retreated from the public eye. The once commanding presence that had loomed over the neighborhood with uncanny precision was now reduced to hushed whispers behind closed doors. The scratches on her SUV, minor yet undeniable, became a visual symbol of the fallout. Friends who had observed the confrontation described the scene as poetic, even cathartic, the enforcer of rules undone, not by rebellion, but by the very hubris that had fueled her obsession. For weeks, she avoided the common areas, her usual patrols reduced to terse glances from behind tinted windows. The HOA, faced with public scrutiny, was forced to review its procedures and, in some cases, rewrite them to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Notices of compliance, fines, and towing policies were revised, clarified, and, most importantly, required transparent documentation before enforcement. The board issued an apology. Carefully worded, of course, but the underlying message was clear. The system could not operate in isolation from accountability. For the first time, it seemed that oversight was not just a tool of control, but a mechanism that required fairness, consistency, and reason. Our family's relief was palpable. Mornings returned to their tranquil rhythms. Coffee on the deck, the kids skipping stones, laughter blending with the natural chorus of the lake. But the experience had left its mark, shaping a cautious awareness that even the most idyllic neighborhoods are not immune to petty obsessions and unchecked authority. We became more attentive, not just to HOA rules, but to the social dynamics that often dictate community interactions. The subtle signals, the power plays, and the silent hierarchies that exist even under the guise of neighborly civility. The incident also reshaped the community itself. Neighbors who had once passively watched now spoke more openly, emboldened by the example of standing firm in the face of arbitrary enforcement. Conversations that had previously been stifled by fear or politeness became discussions about fairness, transparency, and the importance of standing up to authority when it is misused. Children, too, noticed the change. They observed their parents engaging confidently, calmly asserting their rights, and challenging a system that had threatened to strip them of simple joys. It was a quiet lesson in resilience, one that rippled subtly through the community. Even Karen was affected in ways she could not immediately control. Her credibility, once bolstered by the perception of diligence and order, had been undermined publicly. Fellow homeowners, who had once deferred to her judgment, began questioning her actions and motives. While she remained within the community, her influence diminished, replaced by a grudging recognition that rules, when wielded unjustly, can backfire spectacularly. In a way, the entire episode became a cautionary tale. Vigilance is important, but obsession, especially when combined with a desire for personal dominance, can erode respect, credibility, and social standing. For our family, the long-term impact was more nuanced than mere vindication. The ordeal had strengthened our resolve, reinforced our sense of justice, and deepened our appreciation for the serenity of the lakehouse. Every glance at the dock, every morning spent watching the mist rise off the water, now carried a quiet triumph, a subtle acknowledgement of what had been defended and preserved. Yet there was also a lasting awareness. Peace in a community is never guaranteed. It must be maintained actively, through attention, dialogue, and, if necessary, unwavering defense against overreach. I began documenting the experience, not for revenge, but as a record for others who might find themselves caught in similar struggles. HOA disputes, as I discovered, are often not about the rules themselves, but about how they are enforced, interpreted, and, at times, weaponized by individuals seeking control. By sharing our story, I hope to empower neighbors to understand that meticulous preparation, calm persistence, and awareness of procedural protections can turn the tide in conflicts that initially seem insurmountable. Knowledge, as much as courage, became our tool of resistance. Interestingly, the incident even fostered a sense of solidarity among residents. Informal conversations blossomed into organized meetings about governance, fair enforcement, and community standards. Neighbors who had previously remained distant now collaborated to ensure transparency in HOA decisions. While some initially feared backlash from Karen or other influential figures, the public nature of the confrontation created a buffer. A shared understanding that arbitrary enforcement could no longer dominate the community without scrutiny. The neighborhood, once a passive audience to petty control, became an active participant in shaping the rules and ensuring accountability. There were moments of reflection too. I realized that the emotional roller coaster, the fear, anger, frustration, and eventual triumph, had fundamentally reshaped my perspective. It was no longer just about property, boats, or vehicles. It was about dignity, self-advocacy, and the capacity to navigate a system that, at times, values procedure over human fairness. The lessons were subtle but profound. Vigilance is essential, documentation is your shield, and calm assertiveness can dismantle even the most persistent efforts at intimidation. And yet, the story carried a cautionary undertone. While victory had been achieved, it was clear that communities are ecosystems of personalities, rules, and influence. Just because one conflict resolves does not guarantee immunity from future disputes. The experience instilled a vigilance tempered by wisdom. Understanding not just the bylaws, but the social dynamics that govern daily interactions, becomes an essential skill for anyone living within a structured neighborhood environment. As weeks turned into months, life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. The dock became a space of recreation once more, the lake a sanctuary of quiet pleasure. The scars on Karen's SUV faded, the fines and procedural threats were rescinded, and the community began to recalibrate toward balance and fairness. Yet the story lingered in conversations, a reference point for discussions about authority, neighborly conduct, and the subtle but powerful ways that rules can be misused. Ultimately, the episode crystallized a broader truth. Accountability matters more than authority, preparation matters more than intimidation, and resilience in the face of adversity is both a personal and communal asset. We learned that standing firm, documenting meticulously, and leveraging knowledge can protect what is most valuable: peace, enjoyment, and dignity. And for neighbors across the street, behind fences, or silently observing, it was a lesson in courage. One family's quiet defiance had rewritten the expectations of what could be tolerated and what could be challenged. The lake house, once merely a retreat, had become a symbol, not just of leisure, but of persistence, awareness, and the power of standing up to petty authority. Every visit to the dock reminded us that the quietest victories often resonate the longest, and that even when rules feel suffocating, clarity, preparation, and composure can transform fear into triumph. Looking back, I understood that our ordeal wasn't an isolated incident. It was a microcosm of the challenges faced by anyone navigating communities governed by rules, personalities, and unevenly distributed authority. And the lesson was clear, yet humbling: vigilance is vital, courage is essential, and justice, even when delayed or obstructed, has a way of manifesting in the most unexpected, poetic ways. So I ask this: in a world where rules can be twisted and oversight can become oppression, how far would you go to defend your rights, your peace, and your dignity? Because sometimes, standing firm is not just about winning a battle, it's about reshaping an entire community's understanding of fairness, accountability, and respect. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long reflections across the water, I realized that our story, while resolved, had left a ripple, one that would quietly influence our neighborhood for years to come, reminding everyone that even the most meticulous enforcers can falter, and that justice, preparation, and courage often speak louder than rules themselves.